Hello and welcome to today's webinar, Finding the Right Information in Your Stockpiled Content. I'm Teresa Resick, Director of Webinars here at AIIM, and AIIM is your host and producer of today's event. And with me today are Kevin Parker from Neostech and Fred Sass from OpenText. And OpenText is the underwriter of today's webinar, and we thank them for their support. And thank you for taking the time to join us today. As we get started, and you can read here a little bit about what AIIM is about, I'm just going to offer you a few pointers for viewing today's webinar. By joining our webinars live, you can customize your own viewing experience, so feel free to open, close, or resize the different windows. Across the bottom of your screen is the list of all the widgets that are available to you. You can download a PDF of the presentation at any time. Just look to the resources list, and there's also a few other documents and links in there to help you learn more about today's topic. Feel free to ask questions throughout the hour using the Q&A feature. We will hold these questions until the end, where we should have about 5 or 10 minutes to answer them, but you can also use this feature to comment or ask for technical assistance. At the end of the webinar, a brief survey will open up in your browser, and I value your feedback and would appreciate it if you would take a few minutes to complete that survey. And you can also suggest other topics for us to cover as well. And you can also access that survey in the list of widgets that are across the bottom of your screen. This webinar is being recorded, and it will be posted to AIIM.org's Resources Webinars page in just a few days. And now I'd like to introduce the speakers that we have with us today. Kevin Parker is an award-winning information management and technology leader with 2 decades of experience in a variety of industries. He is the Director of Information Management Strategy at Neostech, and Neostech is an IT services firm helping U.S. federal agencies put their information to work. Kevin is a certified information professional and has earned several AIIM training certificates. He is also the president of the National Capital Chapter of AIIM. And we also have with us today Fred Sass, and Fred is a Senior Director of Product Marketing at OpenText. And in this role, Fred leads a team responsible for positioning, messaging, and thought leadership for a portfolio which includes the eDocs suite of enterprise content management solutions. Fred writes articles and white papers and is a frequent speaker at webinars and industry events. He has over 20 years of experience in technology companies, including IBM, AT&T, and Concept Wave Software. So right now, I am going to turn things over to Kevin Parker for him to begin, and there's an impressive list of all of the certifications and certificates that Kevin holds from AIIM.
Thank you, Teresa, and welcome everyone. So we want to talk about this problem today and really identify it for what it is. The problem is information chaos. You may feel like this woman here with the papers everywhere, and the same thing happens with digital. We think, well, digital things are files I can search for, and so it ought to be easier. But the problem is we continue to make more and more of it. And so as we continue through our daily business processes, through the things that we do day in and day out, there are so many people that have maybe an hour, 2, 3 hours sometimes a day where they're spent just looking for information. Help, I can't find the right information, or I sent the wrong version. That may have happened to you. I once witnessed, and the agency will remain nameless, but a U.S. federal agency where the director of that agency sent the wrong versions of documents to the director of another agency, and then suddenly document management became a thing. So it is something that happens at all levels of an organization. There are all these different systems that we use. In the diagram here, I just have an example of about 20 different systems that one enterprise may use, and that's actually pretty conservative when you look at all the different lines of businesses and all of the different functions within an organization. There are so many disparate systems, and yet it just takes so long to find that information and to get it to the right people at the right time in order to do the right things. And part of the problem is we keep hearing about big data, but it's a real thing, and it is a crisis that is continuing to grow. So 90% of the world's data that exists today was created in just the past 2 years. And this is a trend that we've seen now continuing every 2 years for several decades. And while enterprise information may not grow quite at that rate, it still doubles every year or two. And there's so much more information from all kinds of sources. We have new gadgets, we have new systems that all this information is coming to us, and we ingest it from a variety of different forms and formats and technologies, and there's a crisis of information chaos. So that's what we're trying to solve today. Now, you could have your information in a very orderly system. Imagine like this library, this famous library, where all these books are in a very well architected system. But you don't just randomly walk up to a shelf and pick up information, and that's how you find things. Libraries have existed now for thousands of years, and as that whole field has evolved, we have learned how to do finding aids and ways to look up things in card catalogs, and there are certain pieces of data or metadata that we use to look up information about the books and other resources that we would find in a physical library. Well, the same thing translates directly into the digital world. Sometimes, again, we assume that because it's digital and I can search for it because the technologies out there exist, that it's magically going to be a lot easier to find. You still need finding aids with digital information. In fact, with the volume and the velocity and the variety, we need them even more than ever. So I want to talk just about some myths about the technology. And this is not me being anti-technology. I am in this field. I work with technology every day. I am a technologist, and I work with vendors that provide some really cool tools to help solve these problems. The problem I find out, though, is that a lot of times there are people who sell technology who try to present to the customer that this tool will solve all of your information problems, and it'll never be an issue, and you don't have to do any work to set it up. And I'm just here to tell you that that may not be the full accurate picture. So the first point here, storage is cheap, so let's keep everything forever. I hear this a lot of times from new clients and others in the industry. It isn't cheap. Yes, the hardware itself tends to get cheaper over time, but the management of that hardware, the redundancies that you need, the ability to protect it and secure it and to find the information is only getting more and more expensive. So let's just throw that myth out. There's a second myth here that search engines can take care of findability. Well, yes, absolutely. Search engine is part of being able to find things, but we sometimes get fooled into thinking that if I just have something like a Google search to be able to find all of my documents, then that's going to take care of everything because I can find stuff when I go to Google or Bing or whatever your preferred search engine is. Well, that's not exactly how those work either. I mean, search engine optimization on the web has been a thing since there were search engines and a web. It is important to know that you create documents and content for the web in a certain way that these search engines can then index and make them more findable. So it's not just we create stuff and the search engine finds it. That's not the way it works. It doesn't do that alone. So the next point here, machine learning can take care of all of the organization stuff in every situation with no human effort. Obviously, this is a straw man kind of argument. No, not exactly. It's getting better. We're getting machine learning and related tools, artificial intelligence, and technologies that certainly can take care of most of the heavy lifting in terms of the finding, the indexing, and those things. But it still takes people to figure out what is important about this stack of information or these different processes. What are the things that we need to track? And then we can turn that stuff over to the tools and let the tools do the hard work. So that's a lot of what today's whole topic is about. So what makes information findable? Well, there are a few different approaches you can take, and these have varying degrees of success depending on the size of the organization and your own habits. The first one is you can manually organize your information. Now, this may work for a company or an organization that's 1 to maybe 3 or 4 people. It requires enormous discipline, and it breaks down quickly as more people are involved and the volumes of the information grow or the complexity of the processes increases. So, yes, you could have a very strict file naming scheme and folder naming scheme and nesting scheme, and then you're able to find information. I've seen small businesses do that because they had a very strict set of a taxonomy and set of metadata that they were able to do all of this. But they still, if something gets filed in the wrong place, they're in a lot of trouble, just as if a physical document got in the wrong row of file cabinets in a larger organization. So can be done. It requires enormous discipline, and it breaks down. Then search engines can index large volumes for keyword searches, but simple keyword searches often aren't enough because you may put in a word that comes back with thousands of results in a large store of content that are not relevant, or it may exclude terms that are documents that are relevant but didn't meet that exact search criteria. So we'll talk a bit more about that later in the webinar. Then there's this approach to tagging things with metadata. And so if you can manually tag information and add search to that, that will make things a little bit more findable, but it requires more effort from all information users. So every person that touches information or creates it or stores it somewhere has to be in charge of actually adding this metadata to these multiple fields. And again, as the organization gets larger, that becomes inefficient, inconsistent, and very unlikely. I can't count how many times I've seen systems rolled out by technical, very smart people that would say, okay, well, we have all this information, but we need these 20 fields of mandatory metadata before someone can save something. Good luck, because that's not been successful in my experience. I don't even like doing it. Even 3 or 4 sometimes gets to be burdensome, especially if you're dealing with a lot of documents. So yes, that's an approach that could work, but probably not sustainable for a large organization. Then we get to the next one here, information architecture and advanced content tools together. So information architecture, we'll talk in more depth in the next few slides, but it helps set up the organizing and tagging framework that is used and leveraged by these advanced content technologies. That is really what makes something scalable and reliable for growing information volumes, very large information volumes. And so even if you have just incredible growth, doubling every 6 months to 12 months of information, you can find things more easily if the tools are set up to use whatever the framework is for your business. And every organization is different. Information architecture is not really something that can be sold in a box or a digital download. So it's important to initially set it up with subject matter experts that know what your business is and know how to figure out what are the important key pieces of data, and then let the tools work with that. So let's get more in depth on some of these. First, information architecture. We designed that. So information architecture as a discipline has been, well, it's been around as long as information has been around in some sense or another, but it really has emerged as a field through the World Wide Web, and it has evolved from library sciences, and other fields have kind of converged to help us to figure out how to structure and organize information. And it deals with these 3 circles of IA that we typically talk about, of context, that's the business context, your content, what the information is, and then the people, the users. And at the intersection of those things is really what we have that we call information architecture. So what is information architecture? IA is the practice of deciding how to arrange the parts of something to be understandable. That's the latest definition out of the Information Architecture Institute from their website. It is the practice of organizing information at the intersection of that content, context, and the users that we mentioned in those 3 IA circles. And it defines the systems for organizing, labeling, navigating, and searching information. Now, we're not talking necessarily technology systems. We're talking about things like a taxonomy, things like certain terms or labels that have to be applied to information in order to be able to find it and manage it through its life cycle. Talking about how do you find it by navigating to it. Which system did I put it in? That shouldn't really be a concern of the users. A good information architecture helps to alleviate a lot of those issues. And it also, of course, enables searching, which is a big part of this whole topic today. So about getting information organized, what do we do? There are some questions that are very important to ask at the beginning. These are big picture strategic questions. Now, these aren't necessarily something I would take at a 10,000 staff organization and start at the top and ask these questions. This typically happens within offices, within lines of business, at least at the beginning of evolving your information store. So this would be particular to certain business processes. What types of information are we managing? What are the things that we need to know about those bits of information or the documents or the processes with the content attached to them? Where do they fit in the business context? So what are the business processes? Do we have certain cases that we're managing? Is there a very specific set of steps that information travels in our organization? Because those questions are going to actually answer much of what you need, if not all of what you need, in order to make information more findable in the future. For each of your process types, what is the single point of truth? In other words, where's the spot that this information should be stored? If we're talking about accounting and finance processes, so what are the documents or the data that comes in to the different processes for accounting at this organization? What are the places that that information needs to be stored, and let's store it nowhere else? Now, some of that comes back to the sort of discipline of an individual or a team to say, okay, we know we're not going to put it here, but you can design your overall system to know, okay, when we input this kind of information at this point in this process, it should only live in this place. So we know at least we can narrow down which system to look in order to find it in the right spot. And then how should the information be organized and labeled? Are there certain things that we have to know, like the date documents were created, or what part of a process, what piece of the organization is it tied to? Are there any legislative things that we have to know about them? What are those bits of information that should help us to organize and label our information? Now, this sounds like a lot of work, and if you tuned in today and you thought, well, I'm just an end user and I want to be able to find my information, how does this apply to me? This applies because the organization needs to start thinking about some of these things at a higher level probably than each individual business process, but it often starts with the folks that are working at the desks, at the workstations, on the mobile devices that figure out, hey, we should track this about this information, and then we can make it more organized and better labeled. The conversation often happens from the bottom up, and then it needs to also at some point converge with a top-down approach to an organizing strategy. So how do we determine what the key metadata is? Information architects do this. You may not think of yourself as an information architect, but if you are doing these types of things that we're about to discuss, then you are doing IA type work, and it's important to recognize that and to make sure that you have the right people at the right tables and right conversations in order to get this stuff into your systems. So what are the pieces of metadata that are required to identify and describe this information? Is there, for instance, an ID for a case? Let's talk about case management. Is there a case ID that always needs to be associated with this? And then that's something that you would apply to every piece of information that ever is associated with that case, automatically, most likely. And then that certainly makes things more findable related to a case. Is there something else that needs to be identified to relate it to other information? So are there entities or organizations that should be related to this? And then if so, how do we connect that up in the system so that we can always find everything related to that entity or that process or that case or litigation or whatever it is that you're working on? How do we manage the information lifecycle? So is there a set of 3 or 4 or 5 stages that this piece of information or this kind of information goes through? Then we need to, have that tied as a label, because when we search for it, we want to find all the stuff maybe that's in progress. So we will look for all in progress documents as opposed to documents that have already been completed and ready to go on to their happy place in the record center, wherever that is. So the next question I would ask is, which metadata can be added automatically based on the context? I have been accused sometimes when I'm making these presentations by other professionals, oh, you're talking about manual metadata adding, and nobody's going to do that. I've already stated here that that's probably unlikely that people are going to add 20 fields of metadata to every document they ever upload or every piece of content they create. So it would be preferable to get something from context if you can. So again, back to the case management idea. If we're working on a case and I'm in a system that knows I'm working on a certain case, any documents that I upload ought to automatically be tagged with that case's ID, with your username because you're the one who uploaded it, with the date, with things like what type of document is this? Is this evidence for some case that has to be adjudicated? Is this some other supporting information that the investigators need to look at, or whatever it is the business process is for that case? That stuff doesn't need to be tagged for every single document. That's what I mean when I say, can it be automatically added based on context? You wouldn't take case information, hopefully, and add things that are irrelevant to that case. So then you wouldn't have extra information that isn't involved with that at all, so it would be extra stuff. No, that probably lives somewhere else, so you should add it to wherever it belongs, and then it's tagged with its contextual metadata as well. But sometimes we have metadata that does absolutely require user input, like maybe just a description of what this thing is that you're uploading, or it's a status. Okay, this is uploaded. What is the current status? Is this complete? Is it in progress? There are some things that doesn't take a lot of work for people to add, and they can still be something that's very relevant to finding that information later. If we determine this key metadata up front and then we improve it iteratively, then it's going to continue to help us refine the tools and to make the tools work way better so that information can be more findable in the long run. So ways to identify key metadata. There are a number of ways, but one of my favorites is to look at whatever enterprise content management application you're using, or intranet, whatever the tool is. Go to the search part of that tool and look at the analytics. And if you don't have analytics reports set them up today so that you can then over time look at, for instance, what are the last 100 query terms that were used. I often will come in to an organization, and that's the first thing that I will do as a consultant. And it is not uncommon for me to see something like a 95% failure rate on those searches of the top terms. So what that means is there are thousands of people in an organization, or hundreds, whatever size your organization, this would still apply, that would search for terms, and then the analytics report will say, okay, these are the top 100 terms from all the different people. And if it's something like a 95% failure rate, that means they are absolutely not finding the information that they're looking for. The information may even exist in the system, but it may be called something else, or there may be different terms that are used, or different forms of the word. So that helps you to understand, okay, here's some ways we should refine our taxonomy and the way that we contextually grab metadata from things, and what things we may ask from users. So what is the success rate? What terms lead to successful searches? What's the failure rate? Which terms are synonyms? Within the top 100 terms, I often will find, once I relate certain words that are actually the same kind of search, I'm down to something like 30 or 40 different terms. And so maybe I dig up the top 200 search queries or go further. It just depends on the volume and the type of business that you're working with. And conduct business analysis with interviews and questionnaires, workshops, and or system investigation. So there's still a case to be made in the cleanup of how we manage our data and identify metadata, to actually talk to humans and figure out what do they think is important about the information that they're working in. Just, charting a process with just a simple flow chart so that you can figure out what all the steps of the process are. There are a lot of things in that discovery that can clue you into what are the kinds of pieces of metadata that would be important for us to find this later. So develop your information architecture artifacts. These are just a few examples here. A taxonomy of terms that describe and structure content and related processes is one, which would include alternate terms. So if you have a certain way that your business describes a business process or multiple processes within that line of business, it's important to understand what that terminology is and what are some alternate terms. By that I mean perhaps it was called something else in the past, but now like org charts change, sometimes regulations change or whatever, and organizational people will still tend to think, well, this is what we called it in the past, so I'll search for that. Or they're new and they don't know that that's what it used to be called in the past. So having this sort of thesaurus of alternate terms also can be helpful. In the AIIM Electronic Records Management course, we teach about a business classification scheme, and there are a couple of different ways that can be done. But one can be related to the org chart, or better yet, even functions within an organization, so accounting and finance, business operations, technology and information management, and whatever the lines of business are, the business classification scheme can be tied to those functions. And maybe that's one way that you can help organize your information. So I would recommend any of these that you need help with, see the AIIM Electronic Records Management course for some very in-depth learning about that. Also, information system and repository maps can be helpful. Just a diagram on a wall that says, here are the systems that we have, and here's the kind of information that goes in those systems. That can be helpful to information architects to be able to say, okay, now we at least know what the different systems are, and we can start to try to clarify this. The real goal here is to make it where end users don't have to think about all this stuff. This is not something we want most business knowledge workers to have to think about in their day-to-day work. And then anything that helps content management tools know what to look for. So there are a lot of different things that you could create. There's no magic formula that works for every organization. Just do what makes sense in terms of identifying that stuff. The example I mentioned, case management. So let's walk through that. Identify the metadata. Does each case have a unique ID? Are there entities or people or organizations that relate to it? Do they have IDs that you want to tag your information with? Users may never have to know that, but the system can easily tag information with that, and then you can find it later in any way that your people need to find it. Are there artifacts for each case? Would they be tied to it as well? Must the dates, the usernames, the status, et cetera, be captured? Do they have to be captured manually? Are you sure they have to be captured manually, or is there some way to automatically capture that even better? And then that will help you to figure out how to feed your search engines and other tools to be able to search and identify this information for users much better. So leverage technology to improve findability. Now we've got an idea of what our information architecture would look like, what our processes are, what the spots are for the information. We can use some of these tools to really get in there and identify this information much better than humans can ever do. So content analytics tools would process repositories of digital information and use usage data to identify relevant metadata, relationships, and insights. These tools can produce reports that will help you to say, okay, here are some terms that the tools think are important. Are these important? And you can verify those and then apply those to groups of information. There's a lot of different things you can do then when you combine content analytics with auto-classification. So the next one, it uses metadata from context or analytics to apply automatically based on rules or machine learning. And there's a lot of different ways, or a lot of different tools. For instance, there are tools in the legal realm of work that can help you do things like predictive coding or other types of technology-assisted review. Those are related to these class of tools that would be helpful in order to find things for legal cases, for litigation purposes. But the same types of principles apply no matter what sector that you're working in or what industry vertical. And then information workflow tools are useful to do things like business process management. It doesn't have to be quite as technical or involved as BPM, but just simple workflow tools that can route documents or other content to the right place just based on that metadata. So back to the case analogy, if you are working on content for a case, the case is closed, and there needs to be a retention set for that case for a certain number of years, then some type of information workflow tool can then route that to its place in the record center, and then all that stuff is still findable later. So these tools, and there are many others, but these are some of the main classification tools that can really help you make information more findable. Advanced search is still a huge part of it. So one, the information is all tagged with good metadata, using humans to enter it, or preferably machines to do all the heavy lifting. Then keyword search is still there. It's just the beginning, though. I'm pretty good with Google is my favorite internet search engine. And I usually can find content if it exists within the top couple of search terms, because I've kind of learned, okay, here are the keywords I would use. But Google doesn't just use simple keyword search algorithms. Neither do any of the advanced enterprise search type tools. So concept searching looks at information that is conceptually similar to the search query that was entered by a person, and it allows for variations in things like spelling, word stems, synonyms, etc. Or it can identify concepts that are related to the search term, not even just terms that are similar, but just, oh, well, this is related to that. But that all takes, the machines have to learn that stuff, and often it is subject matter experts that help train it and to make it better. Then faceted search allows you to refine your search results based on metadata, categories, tags, content types, etc. The best example I can come up with for this, that something I use on a very regular basis, is the user experience at Amazon.com when you go to buy something. So whether it's I'm using it for the streaming video or for buying books, which I still buy books. I know there are a lot of people that still do. Or whatever the product is, there is not a better experience that I've had personally as a consumer than their site to be able to go in and say, okay, well, I'm looking for something in technology. I'm looking for this, and then I'll put in my search term, and then it'll come back with things that are similar and then things that are very close to what I have looked for. And then I can refine based on the facets, the terms. So if I'm looking for, let's say, a scanner, a consumer scanner just for my house, then I can say, well, I needed to do this, I needed to do this. You can start to refine those things. Someone had to enter that information, or at least had to teach a tool to enter the information about that product. So then it makes it much easier for the user experience to find it on the other end. Just by way of clarification, so metadata is information. We say data about data, but that's kind of a definition that doesn't mean a lot. It's any kind of information that describes or structures some other information. So when I have a document, the metadata can be like the title, the author, it can be, what case it belongs to, and that type of thing. How is that related to a taxonomy? So a taxonomy can be something that's flat, or it can be something that's hierarchical. It really just depends on your needs for that particular organization, that line of business. But it doesn't need to get super complicated and have like 100 layers. That stuff I don't have good experience with very complicated taxonomies working. But a simple taxonomy can just help to relate terms, and it certainly can help the tools to relate documents and other content that are related to those search terms. So hopefully that does some clarification there. So when we're looking at metadata and the indexes for search, search engines have to crawl all that information. They're doing basically their own content analytics. And you combine that with really powerful content analytics tools, and then the indexes that result have very quick and hopefully more relevant search results whenever a user goes to look for information. So it's important to continue to improve this by monitoring your search analytics and move that 90 to 95% failure rate to a 95% success rate. That's actually one of the easiest things to fix with all this stuff that we're talking about today, and yet from a user standpoint, that is one of the best things that they can have fixed. Is suddenly I found relevant information in the top 10 documents. 8 of them were relevant instead of I've got to search through 1,000. That's a very quick win in terms of how we can make this improved, but then you continue to improve it over time. You update your indexes, your search tools, and your navigation with the improved metadata automatically, and you provide some help to users in how to search their information better. So a little bit of training or some type of in-context help is good. So maybe there's a better way they can add their search terms. Well, maybe don't say you need to go to a week-long conference just on how to do a search query, but you could spend 5 minutes showing them how to do something better, maybe create some kind of help that they can have, or it's on your internet. Here's how to search better. So all these little things add up to very big improvements in terms of being able to find information. When should these tools be leveraged? Well, categorize and label information automatically at capture whenever possible. So a lot of these same things apply if you're digitizing large volumes of information. So they come in, the scanner tools can do a lot of this content analytics and auto classification right there. And whether it's born digital or it's something you're still ingesting paper, or it's usually a combination, then you capture that metadata at the beginning as much as possible, but it's still going to add other metadata. So if a document goes through a process and the process is now, it's at this stage, it's at stage 3, it's at stage 4, that's still metadata that you would be able to look at later because you can run reports on that kind of stuff. Apply the same techniques to your stockpiled content though. So you already have terabytes or larger, hundreds of terabytes or even more of stockpiled content. Well, apply these same techniques with the simple information architecture plus the technology tools and index that stuff and make it more findable. Improve the search experience. So this little screen capture here is from a show called Marvel's Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. And this episode really stuck out to me as I was thinking about search, because here you have Agent Fitz standing there with this virtual display, and he's able to go through all these S.H.I.E.L.D. databases. Now, S.H.I.E.L.D.'s a fictional government agency, as far as we know, and they have all this information that's very neatly tied up in these little virtual boxes, and they can go through and look at personnel records or whatever it is that he was searching for. And I just thought, well, that's such a cool user experience. It'd be great if all of our search experiences were like that. And then, of course, I think, well, that stuff didn't get all nice and neat on its own, and there wasn't really, I mean, imagine that, you know, suspension of disbelief here, this could be a real thing. The search experience has to be at least initially thought through and then continually improved by a smaller set of professionals so that the whole organization can do a lot better with it. But I still really think this is a cool episode here. Improving search means that good search doesn't happen if you just set it and forget it. That's one of the biggest fallacies I see with enterprise content management systems is, well, we turned it on, we turned on the ECM system, and search works because I can go there and search. But does anyone own the search? Are they improving it? Are they looking at the analytics? Do they are they making any types of effort to actually make the search experience better for users? I've seen organizations that had 4 or 5 different search engines, and people were searching the same terms across all of them, and yet the information did not live across all of them, and they weren't finding what they were looking for. It's very frustrating, but it can be improved. So content analytics, classification, indexing, advanced search tools, they all combine to provide a much better experience and better search results for users. You allow that refinement based on the facets, the content types, the dates, or any meaningful way that you can think of. You may come up with some way in the future that says, we want to do this type of search with these reports. We want these business intelligence dashboards. Well, all this stuff that I've talked about today, if you do that up front, you're going to be able to combine information in very meaningful ways to present to users that they'll just love. But it only works if you do a little bit of work at the beginning. Allow refinement, as I mentioned, but then aggregate and display related information wherever the users work. So very quickly, there are some other information governance benefits that are the subject of other webinars and other resources, but I just want to list them here. Doing these things helps you with rot removal, with the redundant, obsolete, and trivial. Getting that information out there means you have less information to index, to search, to present to users. So that's better. You can provide better security because you have better metadata. You can protect information that's sensitive or other privacy concerns much better than if you don't know where it all is. E-discovery, legal holds, FOIA, Freedom of Information Act requests, all these things get better when you've applied better metadata up front. And future migrations, because information is going to probably move from whatever your current systems are to some other system. If you've got this stuff lined up well with metadata, you're going to be in good shape. And so do the information architecture to leverage the right tools, monitor and make continuous improvements, and then realize some other important information governance benefits, many of which we didn't even mention today. So with that, there's my contact information, and feel free to reach out to me. I'm going to turn it now over to Fred from OpenText.
Well, thank you, Kevin. And it's really good to be here with the AIM community. And I'll tell you, this is a topic that's really close to our hearts here at OpenText, and I was really pleased to see what you had to say there. And let me tell you a bit about what I'm going to cover today. I've just got a handful of slides, and I thought I should paint a picture of what we're seeing in terms of, customers that are really getting this right. And I call it 4 common practices of companies that successfully enable staff to find the right information in their stockpiled content. So sort of a long title, but could have created a longer list, longer than that 4, but I wanted to keep it to about 4 points. And if I can just say a few words about OpenText, hopefully you know a little bit about us. We've been in this space for about 25 years, and certainly ECM is the core of what we do, and there have been different labels on that over the years. But we have a pretty broad portfolio, and we actually refer to it as Enterprise Information Management. And if you look at that circular graphic on the left, it has various subcategories. But I mainly wanted to point out what you see in that outer ring of the graphic. We talk a lot about our mantra being from insight to engagement, which I think is in line with what we're talking about here today, right? It's about looking at these processes and systems in terms of drawing out insights and then using them for some engagement you have with customers or suppliers or employees or whatever. So let me get into it. I'm going to move on to the common practices we see, and these are compiled pretty non-scientifically, just from working with hundreds of customers over the years and seeing some of the things that some companies do better than others. And don't feel bad if you're not doing all these. Not everybody is there yet. All right, I wanted to start here, and this is more of a mindset thing, I think, although, I'd say it gets it reflected in your actions too. And, the companies that are doing the best job at this, don't think of enterprise content management as a one-way repository or really as a repository at all, you could say. I like the way John Mancini put it in his webinar, here back at AIIM back in December. I believe he said something like the more modern way of approaching it is to focus on using content and extracting insight, which sounds really obvious, but we know not everybody approaches it that way. I'd throw it out there that the companies that came to ECM with more of a compliance mindset, are probably less likely to think of it this way, versus someone that came with more of a productivity mindset. And my second bullet there is something we talk about a lot at OpenText, and that's content in context, and we could have a whole webinar on that. But the idea is you deliver information based on the context of the activity someone's working on. And Gartner talks about this too in some of their work recently to evangelize the term content services. And the last point of this slide is about the bigger trend towards digitization. And we think that the leading companies are really thinking of ECM as part of their digital transformation. Not just storing documents. Okay. All right. Another common practice that we see among the leaders that they spend time understanding what their employees are looking for. What you might think of as, what do you have and how is it used? Kevin talked about this when he was talking about doing search analytics and looking at your top 100 terms. And, it can be a couple things, right? It can be reporting analytics, so you understand the metrics I listed on the right, what kind of files you have, how often they're accessed, who's accessing them. And it's also just talking to users in terms of what they're trying to do and what seems to be just beyond their fingertips, the kind of service Kevin does when in some of his engagements. And this does really impact how you organize your content and where you need to invest in technology. And of course, companies like OpenText have lots of software. We can sell you, but you really don't want to go too far down a technology path until you've looked into some of those basics. The next practice we see is critical to invest in energy is things like auto-classification, reclassification. Kevin gave a nice introduction to this, so I won't rehash it. And just to amplify what he was saying, it's not just about your initial metadata collection when the document's first submitted. These things change over time, and you'll never get your taxonomies and schemas perfect. So you really want to have some technology that's continually extracting metadata and building up the foundation. And as I say in that first bullet there, this is really the game changer. And I think Kevin was stressing this as well. You really need to stay on top of this to have that foundation of metadata to be in a position for your users to find that needle in the haystack, as they say. And one, our common practice, the last one I want to talk about is kind of speaks to that payload at the end. And let's say you've done a good job organizing your information and making all the right metadata is collected and accessible. And there's been so much good R&D lately on search technologies. And let me say as well that everything isn't always neatly in one repository. So the leading companies have figured out that they need to access that long tail of fragmented sources and dark data, if you know what I mean. And when I say smartly in the slide title there, I'm talking about much more than the straightforward text search from the old days, kind of the keyword searches, as Kevin was saying. I really encourage you all to get educated about things like semantic technologies, that can look at your unstructured content and can apply inferred metadata on that content. And when you get some search results, be able to say, that's on the right track. Show me some more that's similar, because really with all this content we have, your users aren't always going to know exactly what they're looking for. So you want to have all the tricks in your bag. Okay, so to recap, in the spirit of reinforcement and repetition, these are the 4 common practices we see from customers that are leading the way on this. Number 1 is that mindset thing. They don't think of ECM as a repository. They approach it from the perspective of using information, extracting insights. The second is that they deliberately set out to understand what their employees are looking for, and this really helps them in terms of how they organize their content and apply technology. Common practice number 3 there is, they're not relying on the original metadata that's created when the document's submitted. They know that they need to be using technology to continually do auto classification, reclassification, things like that. And finally, they're giving tools to their users that apply some modern smarts to find that information, even if it's not exactly what they're looking for right away. Well, thanks everyone. As I close it out, let me say that if you want to learn more, you can go to that first link you see on the slide, and there's a video about our eDocs ECM solution. It'll only take you a minute or two to watch. And the second link is a blog that I wrote on the topic. And that's it for me. So Teresa, I think it's time for our Q&A portion. So why don't I throw it back to you now?
Sure, thank you. And actually, I'm going to pop it back on this slide for just a second, because just to remind everyone that there's the resources list that's to the right of the slide area, and both of these links are in that resources list. So if you just click on that link now, it's going to open up in another browser tab. So when the webinar is over with, you can go back and check out those materials afterwards. And also some other things that I have in the resources tab. And a little bit here with this, and Kevin mentioned about AIIM's electronic records management training that we have. So even if you go to aim.org/ERM, or there's a link to just the general AIM training page that's in the resources list, there's just a lot of information about a variety of different training resources available to you. And so I just wanted to mention that in particular. I personally have taken the ERM class recently, and it's so helpful and so insightful, and I know Kevin is one of our teachers for that program, so I just want to encourage you to take advantage of that information that's there. So questions, lots of questions coming in here. Let me jump to these. The first one I want to go ahead and ask, Fred, you mentioned specifically talking a little bit about auto classification and reclassification. What's the difference on that one?
Yeah, well, it's mainly when it's done, I guess, and why. And if you think of the user creating a new document, and they save the document to the system, let's say, and we ask them to fill out some fields, and that's the manual tagging that Kevin talked about, and there's limited appetite for that. So auto classification can get the system to extract the metadata when you're submitting it and do whatever classification that's warranted based on your situation, your rules. But reclassification for us is more about going back later. It's let's say the document's already been classified years ago, but something's changed. Maybe you've let's say agreements. Maybe you had a classification of agreements, but now your reality of subclassifications, supplier agreements, and customer agreements. So this would be more what reclassification is about. I'm sure that other vendors use different technology, but that's how we approach it here at OpenText. What do you think, Kevin?
I'm actually having some technical difficulties, so can you repeat that part of the question? I'm trying to.
Don't worry.
That's
okay. Go on to the next one.
Let me interject a sub-question to that, because we talked about with a metadata structure that's something that gets updated and becomes for what information that you collect over time on the information. Does there come a time when you realize, oh, we should have been collecting these other types of information bits on the content? Is that a time when that reclassification comes back into it so that those documents are put back through the system again?
Yeah, exactly. And in that example I gave about agreements. So one time you thought it was great to have a classification title agreements, but you realize down the road you've got a whole set of customer agreements, supplier agreements, employee non-disclosure agreements, and that's now important to your current reality. So you want to do that kind of reclassification, and there's a million examples like that.
Okay, so this is Kevin again. I'm back, and
yeah.
Yes, there are many times where things change names, or even like mergers and acquisitions, or just things happen, and over time organizations evolve, and you have to reclassify things. Maybe it's as simple as reassigning the same term to another term, but often it's hey, here are the new sets of terms. Here's how they relate, and let's go apply this with the tools across our content stores, and then we'll get back better search results. There's also a question in here about how it relates to language in multiple languages in a multinational organization. I'll just go ahead and throw that one out there. And
sure.
There are tools available for internationalization of these. Some ECM or other types of content systems can deal with internationalization natively, and yet it's really just it's a function of the same type of synonyms. So if you've got content that has to be available in multiple languages, whether you're auto-translating that or there are multiple translations available that people did, but the tools can be used to apply those with different terms from different languages as well. That's not something I'm an expert in, but there are definitely experts out there that can help with that as part of the overall search scheme.
I have a question here talking about with the infrastructure, and Kevin, if I'm going to start this with you, integrating content that is stored in the cloud versus on-prem, and incorporating that into an ECM strategy in general. If you can just touch on your thoughts on that.
Very good question. And however you architect your internal systems, and sometimes you don't have any control over that because they're legacy systems that have been around a while, but if you have any control over it, trying to view what you have internally as sort of an internal cloud, and especially if you virtualize these servers, then you're needing a map of what all your systems are wherever they are, and it's really irrespective of cloud versus on-prem. Then at that point, your search tools need to be able to connect up, or your analytics and whatever tools that you're using to find these things need to be able to look across all those repositories as if it's just one set of repositories wherever they live. Then the users should be able to do search terms and queries and come back with relevant results and just point them to the right place. I am not a fan of having multiple search engines so that users have to figure out, well, this content's stored way over here, and this is in the cloud, this is on this service provider. I'll go search there. If you can provide a unified search across all of those, we sometimes call it federated search or enterprise search. Those have different shades of meaning, but essentially it's about being able to search across all your content repositories that are relevant to your job.
I have a slightly different question here, and Fred, let me go ahead and start this with you. Someone's asking about, wouldn't big data or artificial intelligence tools do a lot of what we were talking about, irrespective of the ECM systems?
Yeah, no, it's an interesting point. I know where the questioner's going. There are a lot of overlapping concepts with big data and AI, and because we're talking about going into massive amounts of content and extracting just the right insights, and that's really what the promise of big data and AI is all about as well. And right now you see vendors like OpenText. And I won't mention any of our competitors' names. I don't like doing that, but you see us developing these advanced technologies that are specially designed for getting information out of your ECM system and its various data sources. So that's what we really specialize in. But if you go back to my first couple of slides, I was talking about thinking of ECM as a key enabler of your bigger digital transformation, and certainly that's the way we're defining EIM here at OpenText. And we're thinking of analytics and AI and big data as all part of that equation. And I just think if we fast forward, I don't know, a few years, I think you'll see a lot of these technologies really coming together more seamlessly. But they're very, very related concepts.
And Kevin, we're actually getting close to the end of the webinar hour, and I'm going to squeeze in one more question here. Because someone's talking about search versus browse, and with using file folder structures as a way of managing the information and the data in the systems. Your thoughts about that and how search can help with that? I know folder hierarchy starts.
Folders, of course, are So folders are a metaphor that comes from the physical world, right? So we would stick documents in folders inside file cabinets, and then go back and access them if we need to. And in certain business contexts with electronic documents and records, that can still work. It depends on the complexity. I still use folders, but think of it as a container that can have multiple facets. So it may not even actually be a folder, but you've applied a certain metadata scheme to a bunch of content, and it looks like folders to the browsing for the users with the browsing experience. But different people, and often in different lines of business or different business functions, will think about how to navigate that information differently. So if you have multiple different facets or tags or keywords or whatever it is you want to call it for your particular context, then you can, from a browsing perspective, make it look like they're all going through folders and working through things that way. But yet, you could still search it too. Some users, there's a percentage of users in every organization that wants to go to a search box. They're the same kind of people that open their browser, and instead of going to some link they know, they'll search for it in their favorite search engine. There's another percentage that would prefer to go through some type of navigation, and they don't mind going 3 or 4 or 7 clicks deep. Some of the user experience research has proven the 3-click rule is not universally applicable. So you really need to provide multiple ways to get to the same information depending on how users think about getting to that information. I think the tools that Fred and I talked about all can help make that a better experience no matter how the user thinks about getting to that information.
Thank you. That's a good clarification there. And actually, we are getting it to the end of our webinar hour. And we've been listening to Evan Parker from Neostech and Fred Sass from OpenText. Just wanted to just make a last few comments here, just to say that the AIIM conference is only 10 days away. I can't believe it's only 10 days away. And there's actually still a few slots left. So if you're interested in coming, please go to the website to register or to get more information. It is in Orlando, Florida, starting on the 14th. And we have pre-con sessions, conference sessions on these AIIM training sessions. And actually, Kevin's going to be teaching one of those on the 13th. So do check it out. Exciting keynote speakers are lined up. Cheryl Cran is going to be talking about change leadership. And Dan Lyons is a best-selling author and Fortune magazine columnist. And certainly loads of educational sessions and a lot of very interactive roundtable discussions. Feel free to check that out on the website. Click the link that's also in the resources list for you. And just want to say, very much want to thank the underwriter of our webinar, OpenText. Without the support from our solution providers, AIIM wouldn't be able to bring you our free educational programs. So thank you, OpenText. I just wanted to remind everyone to download all of the resources that's to the right of the slide area. Also to remind you when the webinar is over, that survey is going to pop open. Appreciate your feedback on that. And just as we bring our webinar to a close, just want to ask each of our speakers for their closing thought or a key takeaway. And first, let me start with Fred Sass from OpenText. Your closing thought today.
Well, mainly just to suggest that people really proactively tackle this. I mean, it seems obvious that your users are going to want to access all the content, do their jobs, but you'd be surprised how few companies are really making this the focus it deserves. So, I go back to that common practice number 2 I talked about. Spend some time understanding what your users are looking for, gathering metrics, how your documents are accessed, and then go from there. That's just get started.
Thanks, Fred. And Kevin Parker from Neostech, your closing thoughts today.
Just to echo Fred there, I would say absolutely making information more findable is one of the best things you can do for their day-to-day work experience. And information technology departments tend to be so focused on just the iron and the electricity and making sure that things are set up a certain way from the technology standpoint, but they need to tune the tools so that users can have a better experience, make things findable. Information architecture doesn't need to be super complicated. It needs to be actually very simple in order to make this stuff flexible and as organizations change and grow. So information architecture plus the tools plus continuous improvement is going to make a big difference in your organization.
Thank you, Kevin. And thank you, everyone, for joining us today. For AIM, this is Teresa Resick, and we'll see you next time. And have a great afternoon.